Hey kids, cook real food. Katie Kimball here for the Healthy Parenting Connector. And boy, do I have a fun story for you today. I was watching this TEDx talk on parenting, and this amazing woman starts out talking about how her kids have snakes and scorpions on their porch. And I'm like, no way, because all of summer of 2020, my kids had snakes and toads and frogs on my porch. And I'm like, we need to connect. Then I find out she's a doctor, an MD, who also does like nutrition and natural wellness. And I thought, how have I possibly not met Dr. Mary Wilde before? So thank you so much for hanging out with me, other mom of snake boys.
Yes, thank you, Katie.
So we're going to have a fantastic conversation today that I did not even see coming, because Dr. Mary Wilde has so many competencies and so many like specialties. She talks about parenting with compassion. She talks about kids with anxiety. She talks about how food improves mood. And I'm like, wow, I thought we were just going to talk about like parenting and feeling good about ourselves at the end of the day. So this is just going to be an incredible conversation. Let me tell you a little bit about our guest, and then we'll jump right in. Dr. Mary Wilde is an integrative pediatrician in St. George, Utah. And this is so beautiful. She uses a strength-based whole child approach to address emotional and behavioral issues in kids, which is so rare among MDs. This is so awesome. Main focus areas are anxiety, ADHD, and parenting. And Dr. Wilde has all sorts of great online resources as well, including a course for kids and teens with anxiety called Resilience School, and a parenting membership community called Compassion Parenting. She is a parent to 8 sons, and somehow in the midst of that found time to be an author, a podcaster, a TEDx speaker, and an MD. And so like, Dr. Mary, we gotta talk about this, because first of all, I would love to hear your story about, you know, the snakes and the scorpions on the porch and a little bit about your boys, but then I gotta hear how you went from being trained conventionally as an MD. And I know that you had like 3 hours of nutrition training. So something happened there between your conventional training and what you did now. Can you connect the dots for us?
Yes. So, as far as the animals on the porch, it was just one of those perfect moments. Um, in 2020, I actually homeschooled my younger kids. I have the luxury of having my own practice and choosing my hours, and I was able to be home with them, and we read the story, The Family Under the Bridge, and then we were at a park, and there were these abandoned little ducklings, and the kids were like, "Mom, can we please take them home and rescue them and take care of them?" And it just was so poetic. It was hard for me to say no. And within that 24-hour period, so we had 7 baby ducks on our porch, and then our kids had also caught some scorpions and some frogs and um, a tarantula. So it was crazy. It was like this crazy 24-hour period. And so
Did
yes,
any of
but
them become more permanent residents in the Wilde household?
well, we did keep the ducks for several weeks, and the kids kept them alive. And my youngest son even drew pictures on the wall in front of our house so they'd have something to look at, like so they'd have scenery.
That's so cute.
But it is cute. Usually we just have temporary borders, you know, but
Got
they're
it.
always coming and going with this many little boys.
I believe that. So at my house, they petitioned for the snakes to come inside. So we have
Okay.
3 permanent resident snakes in this huge enclosure in my little boy's
Wow.
room. And I believe it's 2 frogs right now. I kind of lose track, but I say you have to tell me or ask me if you're going to have
Yeah,
any new tenants, because this is really important. Mom needs
right.
to know. But yeah, they feed them live frogs and fish and all
Wow.
sorts of craziness.
So fun.
Yes, but we're going to talk about feeding humans today. So how did you
Right, that
go
will
from,
tie in perfectly.
yeah, exactly, live frogs? How did you go from the, you know, being just a pediatrician, I say just,
Mhm.
you know, going through medical
Yeah.
school, and then
Mhm.
changing your focus to anxiety in kids and food?
So all along, I wanted to be a pediatrician, but from the beginning, I just never quite settled in or felt aligned with the approach of just medicating everything.
Mm,
And that's not necessarily what all MDs do, but it does tend to be one of the go-tos, and it just did not resonate with me. So from the beginning, I really was looking for an integrative focus with mind and body and spirit strategies. And I had a wonderful mentor in my residency program who is a developmental behavioral pediatrician, and he focused on mind body medicine and specifically using a lot of imagery and self hypnosis to help kids with chronic pain and anxiety and habits. And he was just amazing, and he totally inspired me to go further in that area. And then I just built from there. And so I have done some training in bio-individual nutrition and self-compassion, mindfulness, yoga calm, um, lots of different things that have really enabled me to bring together both the physical wellness and the emotional wellness in a really beautiful way.
That truly is beautiful. And just thinking about, I can't even imagine how blessed your families are coming to their regular pediatrician, but also, getting options for healing
Mhm.
mind, body, and spirit. So
Mhm.
cool. But you also focus on parents too. And I mean, what are you seeing, Dr. Mary, as far as parents being overwhelmed and feeling like they don't have the tools to approach their day? Like, are we really more overwhelmed than ever, and why?
Well, I think we feel overwhelmed, but I think we're as capable as we ever were. And I think that we need to get reconnected with that. And with all the information that's around, I think it can be very overwhelming.
Yeah.
And it's true, though, that there are some new challenges that our kids are facing and that we're facing as their parents, with the pandemic, with different global issues, with political issues. There's so many stressors and high tension things going on that I think we do need to focus more on giving our kids emotional tools. A lot of parents think, well, I didn't ever learn these things and I was fine, but we grew up in a different time.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that really brings both my worlds together too, in terms of resilience and compassion, I think um, research has shown that compassion in the state of um, having self-compassion, which we need as parents, it really does build resilience. And resilience being the capacity to bounce back. And don't we need that more than ever with all, we're kind of jerked around by all kinds of things right now, in terms of um, not knowing what to expect in terms of the health issues and all kinds of things. So
Yeah.
it just is, I just feel really passionate about being able to offer a lot of tools in one place in that resilience school, because I teach modules with mind strategies, body strategies, and spirit strategies that are all evidence-based. And as an MD, I really care about research and evidence, but I think so many people don't realize that there really is so much evidence about these integrative strategies. And so that's what I really am excited to share.
Yeah. So more resilience means less feeling of overwhelm, right?
Mhm.
And so let's go back to self-compassion, because when I hear that, I'm like, like it's this sort of ethereal word to me, and I don't really know what that looks like day to day, like really practically. So if you're saying, okay,
Right.
parents, you need self-compassion as a tool, like what does that
Mhm.
tool look like and sound like in our heads? Is there a lot of self-talk
Mhm.
going on?
Well, Kristen Neff is one of the biggest researchers in the compassion space, and she showed that when we can have compassion, and compassion is um, a state, a physiological state where we have our parasympathetic nervous system balancing out our sympathetic nervous system.
Mhm.
So we're able to have this sense of calm, um, even in the face of stress. And that's why it builds resilience. And some components that she talks about as being part of compassion um, our mindfulness, and that's having self-awareness and just
Okay.
being present. And I think that in our busy world, sometimes we don't take time. And so that presence is a really important aspect. And then connecting with common humanity, realizing, okay, I'm struggling with this. I don't know what to do in this situation. Um, I feel um, stressed out and strung out and burned out, but I'm not alone because just about every other parent is feeling these things too. And that just brings it takes away the shame of those feelings because we don't operate well under shame. Um, so if we can realize that and connect with the idea that others are struggling with the same thing, and what type of ideas and compassion would we extend to them, and can we reflect that to ourselves? And then thirdly, an idea of self-kindness, and that's very connected with self-talk and self-care. And it really is an important skill as parents to be able to show our kids what it looks like to be a healthy adult.
Mm.
And um, that is one of the main ways that we can help support their emotional wellness. Um, and and so I think all of these things come together and allow us to really stand as a support to our kids without kind of going down in the storm. And that's what I think compassion, that's why I was so drawn to the word compassion, because it's feeling with or suffering with, but it's not being in. Like empathy is like being in feeling, but sometimes we can kind of get this empathetic distress where we kind of are going down in the storm. We get
Okay.
caught in this emotionality, which of course we will feel the feelings with our children, but we have to be the ones though that can be an anchor as well. So that's what I focus on in my membership.
Wow. And we are our own worst critics, aren't we? And so,
Yes.
yeah, we need that. And that whole idea of mindfulness, I'm like, oh yeah, like my brain is always doing five other things.
Right.
And so it's a good reminder. It's a good reminder to just
Mhm.
focus on one thing, whether that's something I'm doing by myself, for myself,
Mhm.
or with my children as a parent, or for my children as a mother. And then, if we need to be that anchor in the storm, of course, that means there is a storm, and raising especially tweens and teens, definitely a little stormy. And so
Yes.
what do we see, with kids and anxiety? And I'm really curious, just because I happen to have a 10, a 13, and a 16-year-old. So I feel
Mhm.
like it's such a range. Do kids experience anxiety differently, sort of at these different ages? And are there different strategies parents need to use to help? Do we protect them and insulate them from anxiety, or what's the best course of action?
So definitely there are different ways that anxiety comes out in different age groups and also different genders there and just different individuals. And so it's important that we educate ourselves, and anxiety and depression are really a huge issue right now. And a recent article came out in JAMA saying that compared to pre-pandemic times, anxiety and depression have doubled in adolescent populations. And in some ways, it's like all these times when we have a article that just kind of reflects what we see. That's just kind
Yeah.
of common sense, but it still validates it that it's not just our imagination.
Right. And I believe it
That
was already 1 in 3
yes.
teens pre-pandemic were depressed and
Mhm.
anxious. So double is
Mhm.
a pretty seriously big number. And then just to sort of let people understand, regardless of when you're listening to the interview, this is
Mhm.
fall 2021. We're still sort of, I don't know how far through this pandemic, if it will ever end. But yeah, our kids have been under a lot of additional burdens for 18 months now, and they are hurting.
And I think that even, if someone comes to this episode and listens a couple years later, I think it's still so pertinent because anxiety does need to be addressed. It's not something that tends to go away.
Right.
It's something that tends to reinforce itself. And there are really habits of thought that just get more ingrained and more ingrained. And living in southern Utah by Zion National Park, I think of hiking trails and how, there are these well-worn paths, and that's like the habit of thought that we create by being anxious again and again and again. Whereas we can create new paths,
Okay.
new neural paths as we learn new skills. And even as parents, we need to learn these new skills, because parenting an anxious child is not intuitive, because we want to just comfort and protect and rescue, and those can be the opposite things that are needed, but we have to balance, and really have wisdom and sometimes external guidance to know when to step in and when to step back. And so I think that it's really, really something valuable to pay
Mhm.
attention to and get educated about.
And what I think I heard you say is basically the more you're anxious, the more you're going to teach your brain to be anxious. And so there
Mhm.
has to be some sort of intervention, right? To turn the
Mhm.
thinking toward a new path, because it's just so easy to stay on the well-worn path, unfortunately, of anxiety. So
Right.
how would you describe that? Like what are some of the mental thinking that will
Mhm.
send kids down the anxiety path? And then what is the reverse? What are some habits of mind that we can teach to
Mhm.
interrupt that cycle?
Well, one of the biggest um, ways that anxiety shows itself is through avoidance, and often when people feel threatened, then they avoid, which makes their world smaller and smaller and smaller, and then people are less able to demonstrate to themselves about their own efficacy, and they lose confidence. And so it's kind of like, we start seeing what we're looking for. Our brain is like a Google search. If we type in, show me all the scary things, show me all the risks, that's what pops up. And so we just get used to seeing those things, and
Okay.
things like perfectionism, and that's really um, a fixed mindset way of approaching the world, where we feel like if anyone finds out that we don't know everything, or that we're not perfect, or that or even if we find out that we're not as good as we thought, then everything comes crashing down. But if we can transition that into more of a growth mindset, where taking a risk is actually a challenge and it's an opportunity, rather than the moment that our cover is going to be blown, so it really creates there's really an important shift that needs to happen. And there's so many tools that can help that. So in my resilience school, I teach the kids that I work with and their parents about cognitive distortions or thought catching related to, cognitive behavioral therapy practices. Um, I teach mindfulness, I teach imagery and self-hypnosis, because it's so powerful how we can change the way we view things. And as we can, catch untrue, unfair, inaccurate thoughts, and make them more accurate, then we can be anxious about things that we really need to be anxious about, instead of all the other stuff. So a lot of times when I'm working with clients in my clinic, I say, if you had to put a number on it, how anxious are you? Like, if you had to say, I'm 50% anxious, I'm 80% anxious. And a lot of times they say, like someone I just saw this last week said, I'm 90% anxious. Like, I'm 8 out of 10 anxious 90% of the time.
Wow,
And
that's
and
high.
and so I just taught her the first module, the kind of the first skill of thought catching. And so her job was to kind of test her thoughts. And because as I was explaining to her, if we were to decrease her anxiety to a more sustainable level, and to a level that is really needed, because we acknowledge together that some stress is needed to keep us motivated and safe. We need to have awareness of the real threats around us, and the the big events and the big opportunities, we need to be aware of those things. But if so much of our energy is taken being anxious about things that aren't even true, that's the one place we can really shave off a lot of, emotional energy. So, but in addition to those mental strategies, we talk about body strategies, and one of those being, addressing lifestyle issues like sleep and diet and exercise. There was a book that came out not too long ago called Spark by Dr. John Rady, and he talked about how exercise is such a perfect balancer of our neurotransmitters that it's like taking some Prozac and some Ritalin, and it's just going outside and getting our heart rate up. And he talks about how so often the cardiovascular benefits of exercise are stressed, and of course those are so important, but he says it's the mental benefits that he values the most and sees as the most powerful. So there's so many things that we can talk about, and I know today we're going to talk about diet as one of those many interventions. And I think it's so important for parents to realize that there are many interventions. It's not just therapy, medication, end of story. That's a very limited view that we have been sort of fed.
Yeah,
But
I was thinking, oh, this is so unconventional. Wait, our sleep and our food and moving our body affects our mind. I don't know if you're even allowed to talk about this, Dr. Mary, right? Like that's, unfortunately, that is the line that we're fed, that's like unconventional, that's alternative. It's like, well, no, like it's very, very clear. Anyone who's been short on sleep or ate a big kind of junk food meal out at a restaurant, like, that affects the way you think, your brain fog and your emotions and the way you treat people the next day after short sleep. So it's so obvious, but we're not generally a mindful culture, right? Not generally an aware generation. We're not even paying attention to that. So it's a beautiful thing for sure to teach that to kids. Should we be jumping in like some nutritional interventions that actually do impact behavior and emotions?
I think it's definitely important to be aware of that. And so as you were asking, about how anxiety can manifest in different ages, in younger kids, often it does manifest in acting out behavior.
Okay. Is that
And
their avoidant? Are they trying to avoid an uncomfortable situation, so they're acting out?
or sometimes they just have big emotions and they don't know how to deal with it. So
Sure.
maybe they're melting down and they're resisting and fighting and screaming and kicking. And when we think, why can't this be easier? Why is this so hard? But often younger kids are, when they're feeling in a state of threat or vulnerability, then it's like, being a scared animal that's, ready to bite and attack and really go at anything that seems to be coming their way. So, and as a pediatrician, I think it's important to mention too that especially with younger kids, when kids are not comfortable in their bodies, like maybe they have a chronic illness or pain or some type of process that's not going right, then kids don't always have a way to articulate that. And so sometimes that does come out as poor emotional regulation. So it's important to kind of look at the physical state and recognize that, like you said, and like we all acknowledge, the foods we eat can play a role in that. And so where I just start out with all my clients and the people in my program is just to have them take a look and take an inventory of just their nutritional habits and, among other things, like sleep and exercise and things like that. But we'll focus mostly on nutrition today. But almost anyone would benefit from some initial interventions. And I think that's where we need to start is just how can we just be eating in a healthy way overall. And some of the things to think about are, getting those fruits and vegetables in, whole grains, whole foods, where we're able to avoid the food additives that come with packaged processed things.
Are there
And
are there kind of good, better, best if you're reading ingredients and you're like, oh, I don't have time to make everything from scratch? Like,
mhm.
do you have any sort of big red flags that you tell parents like at all costs try to avoid these things?
Well, I think even at the grocery store, so let's just start out at the grocery store. Just picking up the food you're going to buy and reading a label, just looking how long that list is.
For sure.
So I think that if there are tons of things that you can't pronounce and you have no idea what they are, then your body probably doesn't know how to process them either. So
True,
it's
true.
important to just take the extra 10 seconds to just pick up what you're going to buy and look at the back of it. And of course, we don't have to do everything from scratch. But on the shelf, there are breads with preservatives. There are breads that don't have preservatives. And it's true that we have to, maybe be a little more mindful about storage of the breads that don't have the preservatives. Um, but just taking that minute to be aware of the extra ingredients that we're bringing into our bodies, I think is really helpful. And then going out to eat, you know, do we choose McDonald's or do we choose Subway? That's probably uh, an example. Subway's not perfect either, but it's probably better than French fries. So I
Give
think
me a
there is
lot
this.
fewer industrial oils at least.
Yes. So I think, there is a good, better, best. And again, bringing in that self-compassion that if we do have to go through the McDonald's drive-through, then it's probably going to be okay because our bodies are actually very resilient and strong and can process most of those things. But if we're just constantly throwing those things into our bodies, then it just is a little harder on us.
Sure. Well,
So,
and I mean, the more we see our kids struggling, right? Like the parent of your
mhm,
client who is 80% anxious 90% of the time or whatever, like
mhm,
that child is suffering and that family is suffering. And
mhm.
so the more you're suffering, the more motivated you are, right? To like take
Right,
those extra steps and take that extra time or spend that extra
mhm,
dollar, to
right.
upgrade
Mhm,
the ingredients. And I know I've
mhm.
found in our life that it's just a baby step approach, right? Where
Exactly.
we talk all the
Yes.
time about what we used to do. My younger kids are
Mhm.
so surprised that when my oldest Paul was about 2, we would meet his grandparents at Wendy's every Wednesday for lunch. And they were
Uh-huh.
like, what's Wendy's? I mean, my other kids are like, what's Wendy's? What is that? What do they serve there? They're so fascinated by this. They really, you took Paul to fast food? He was only 2, mom. They're like, what were you doing? And now we're to the point where
Right.
I had to go through the McDonald's drive-through 2 years ago to buy some chicken nuggets as a
Mhm.
prop for a video. And it was so funny. I felt guilty. I felt like someone was going to see me. And I
Mhm.
I could almost not stop myself from saying to the person who handed me the bag, like, don't worry, I am not going to eat this. Like, don't worry. It's okay. It's just a prop.
That's
Like
so
I
funny.
felt like cover of
Yes.
darkness. I need to like hide this. So just kind of feeling that huge shift in
Mhm.
myself, but it was not a huge shift in one day or one year. It was baby steps
Right.
over a decade. And that's definitely where, that self-compassion
Yes.
comes in. Do
Yes.
you have any favorite foods, like particular foods where you tell your
Mhm.
patients and clients, like, boy, if you could really integrate X, Y, and Z into your diet, that'd be
Mhm.
so mood regulating, stuff like that?
Well, I don't really do that. I try
Okay.
to just kind of tell them to I ask them what are their favorites, what are their favorite fruits and vegetables, and try to have them at least go for those
Okay.
and celebrate those. And certainly there are, a healthy diet includes healthy fats, it includes whole grains, at least for most people.
Mhm.
Um, and so I talk to them about low glycemic index foods and trying to
Okay.
keep blood sugar levels um, more stable so their kids aren't just having these highs and lows and where their moods are up and down and
Okay.
and there's different research about sugar. Some people blame everything on sugar and some of the research says you can't just say it's the sugar because but we do know and we feel different when we have these simple carbs or these high sugar foods. We just know we feel different. And so I think that trying to just, I focus on general principles of, eat plants as much as you can, whole grains, meat sparingly, um, try to balance in the healthy fats, avoid junk food as much as possible, junk food in moderation, make it livable, and, not drinking calories. So trying to really limit the soda and just trying to go with more simple ingredients, home prepared foods when possible, um, and avoiding the really highly processed items. So mainly kind of general principle things. And then, um, especially because I work a lot with kids with ADHD, I really encourage supplementation of omega-3s.
Okay.
And because hardly anyone eats enough fish to really optimize that. And so, um, that's a big thing. And then also looking at, some common deficiencies that can affect mood. And those would include things like vitamin D, iron, zinc, and magnesium. And those are things that can be tested for. And sometimes, we don't always draw labs. A lot of times, we, think about risk factors and make decisions about that, whether we want to actually draw labs or just work on the diet in general and work on getting a healthy vitamin and mineral supplement as well. But really, if you have a vitamin D deficiency, just taking a regular vitamin doesn't address it sufficiently. You need to have really higher dose vitamin D. Um, so, those are the general principles that kind of I address with everybody, but then we also have to acknowledge that we're all individual. And so sometimes there are food sensitivities that come in, and those can really affect how people feel. They can, there's food allergy and there's food sensitivity. And I think it's important for parents to understand the distinction. So food allergies are mediated by the immune system. They're correlated with high IgE levels. Often they cause things like hives and sometimes gastrointestinal disturbance like nausea and vomiting, but more, things like hives, swelling, itching, breathing difficulty, anaphylaxis, and then some of the other things that sometimes we maybe call an allergy. It's really more of an intolerance.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the
Or
IgE, that's in the blood.
sensitivity.
So an allergy can be blood
Right,
tested for, whereas a
exactly.
sensitivity, it needs more of
Yeah,
that awareness. How do you help parents
right.
figure out sensitivities in their kids?
So I really have them, if there are some of those symptoms of headaches or frequent stomach aches, nausea, then I recommend keeping a food log so they can try to correlate. Because a lot of times we just go and we don't make connections between, oh, every time I eat cheese, I get a headache. Or, every time I have MSG, I get a headache. Um,
Well, and
so,
things like dairy, gluten, and eggs, you might be eating them at every meal or eat every
right.
meal and every snack.
Yeah,
So how would you even see correlations? Do you recommend
right.
eliminating a food for a day or 3 days or 30 days or anything just to like test or just the observation?
Yeah, so that's what I was going to mention next is,
Yeah.
definitely there are certain foods that people tend to be sensitive to or allergic to. And it's interesting because there's, a lot of people, and there's kind of a trend of getting food sensitivity tests where you get blood drawn and get IgG levels, but there's not a lot of science behind that it's truly showing us an intolerance. Some people get the results of that and they say, oh, actually that makes me think I do feel uncomfortable after I eat eggs or whatever. But um, in general, they're not super helpful. So I think that it's mostly, a forward looking of doing a food log or if we really want to know, then we do need to go the elimination diet route. And so maybe I will talk a little bit about some of the foods that tend to be most, the biggest culprits to the food sensitivities. And so sometimes they're the things that we eliminate first. And in order to really know if these things are bothering you, you have to be very strict and really do it for several weeks, like 6 weeks is what I recommend. And it's not forever because, once you are eliminating certain foods and food groups, then it's really important to make sure you're kind of working with the guidance of a healthcare professional or a dietitian, because it can be easy to then start getting into some deficiencies. And sometimes when we think we're being really healthy, like, oh, we're going to go gluten-free, but some of the foods that are labeled as gluten-free are really not very healthy because they substitute a lot of starches and sugars and filler ingredients. And so
Yeah.
it's really important to be aware. So some of the diets that really have been shown to affect mood are, or I guess maybe some of the culprits that cause some irritability and acting out behaviors and anxiety, things like that, would be salicylates, amines, and glutamates. And so those are some things that we look at. And then also in terms of like ingredients that you would recognize, it would be
Right. I
like
was just going
milk,
to ask for clarification.
dairy, soy, and eggs. Those are some of the 4 big ones. And so there are 3 main diets that I think are packaged pretty nicely to test. So you
Okay.
can, if you're suspicious about a certain food, like a specific thing, you can just do an elimination diet with that. Or if you have like 3 or 4 things, you can take them all out and
Mhm.
then add one back at a time.
Okay.
But there are 3 diets, and they have, plus or minus um, research. Some research says no, they don't help. Some research says yes, they do. But it scientifically makes sense that they would help, and there are definitely individuals that are helped by these diets. So I think it's worth a try, at least like for
Okay.
6 weeks. Those would include the Feingold diet, which is mostly avoiding additives
Mhm.
and having a low salicylate. Then there's a fail-safe diet that's a little stricter than that, and it's no additives or flavor enhancers, low um, salicylate, and low amine. And I'm sure that that doesn't mean anything to most people who are listening, but it can be looked up. And
Okay.
I will be giving a link to a handout that I've made that have clickable links where you can go to an explanation of all these diets.
Great. Thank you.
And then there's the Reed diet, which is the reduced excitatory inflammatory diet, and it focuses on whole foods, eliminating additives, low glutamate, and it's gluten-free, casein-free, soy-free. So
Okay.
that's basically like wheat, dairy, soy.
Yeah.
Um, so those are places to start, and really with any intervention, in order to make any sense of it, you kind of have to just do one thing at a time, be
Mhm.
really strict about it, and then add things back also one at a time.
Mhm.
So like even if you're doing, let's say you're doing a Feingold diet and you say, okay, we're not going to do any artificial dyes, we're not going to do any preservatives, and we're going to cut down on the salicylates. And there are different foods that interestingly, they're things that are supposed to be healthy, but for some people they're not
Sure.
tolerated well. Um, some berries,
What
you
are
know,
salicylates? Because now are they in
right.
berries?
So they are in different foods, and I think that it's like goes beyond the scope of this conversation, and
Oh,
it would be
okay.
sort of like boring to just like make food lists. But basically, salicylates and amines
Mhm.
have a phenol group, and so and salicylates specifically are a chemical that are in plants that kind of protect it, like it's kind of
Okay.
like it keeps funguses and parasites and things like that away, but it's also can be we can have sensitivities to them. Most
Wow.
people don't. Most people don't. And so that's why I wanted to start with just saying like just, fruits and vegetables and whole grains, low glycemic index. Um, and
Sure.
one thing I didn't mention is, organic when you can, especially for the, highest offending, highest pesticide level type fruits or
Sure.
vegetables. Um, but beyond that, just recognizing that we are individuals, and so some some things that are supposed to be healthy, like grain, if you have celiac disease, they are not healthy. They will
Right.
make you, very create a huge inflammatory response and a huge immune response.
Mhm.
Um, so just being able to, test um, and then add things back,
Mhm.
after the weeks go by. And like I said, there are lists you can, thankfully Google, and if you're at a relatively reputable site, then you can acknowledge, okay, and look at a couple sites and make sure that
Sure.
they, correspond. But um, like amines are in cheeses and dark chocolates and anything fermented or,
Mhm.
overcooked meats and things like that. And um, um,
So they're not necessarily your normal culprits, gluten, dairy, soy,
right,
eggs. This
right,
goes way beyond. So what a great
exactly.
thing. What a great thing for families who are worried about their kids. Like you said, it's kind of worth trying a thing or two, right? We're also bio
Mm-hmm.
individual. You can't just look at a child or even look at a child's presentation of symptoms and say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, got it. I know exactly what you need to
Right,
eat and not eat. Like we
right,
unfortunately just have to be those detectives, but our
exactly.
kids are worth it. And I know
Yeah.
we're winding down here, Dr. Mary, but maybe you
Mm-hmm.
can tell us a little bit how people could learn more from you, and perhaps
Mm-hmm.
like one sort of last message of hope on how to get the
Mm-hmm.
kids on board, or what parents, sometimes we talk about scary things. We're like, oh, this sounds scary and
Right.
hard. So I always want
I
to end with
know.
that message of
Exactly.
hope for families.
The ray of light.
Yes,
Well,
yes.
I think that one thing to emphasize is that with any of this, I think it's useful to really have a conversation with our kids, not suddenly get super restrictive, but really talk about like why we're doing it,
Okay.
and be willing as a family to experiment together and say, we're gonna just take these things off the menu for a little while. And it seems really hard, but really when you think about it, it takes time to go to the doctor, it takes time to go to a therapist, it takes time to fill a prescription, it takes
Sure.
money to fill a prescription, and then you have to deal with side effects, and you have to, so with anything you do, it does take some time, some research, some investment. And the wonderful thing is it feels a lot safer to be um, kind of working with kitchen table items. Um,
Hmm.
and if we could find something that could be helpful and useful, then it's so worth it. And
Absolutely.
like I said, we can get really valuable information in the course of a few weeks, which
Mhm.
is also the amount of time it takes to, for example, have a anxiety medication come to full effect. So,
Okay.
but I will say that in most cases, it is really a multifactorial solution. Um, and so, it doesn't have to be overwhelming, but we can just take one thing at a time and investigate one piece at a time. And, if parents want some help with this, this is what the resilience school that I do is all about. It's like using these mind, body, spirit tools, but with some guidance, so you're not having to be the ones to do all the research and like
Yeah.
be feeling like you're shooting in the dark. So, but it definitely, our kids are worth it, and just one thing at a time. And most of us, we don't require these fancy diets. Most of us would benefit anyway from just eating more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, um, those whole foods, and so we'll just be doing our whole family a favor to just
Yes,
think a
cutting
little
out the
bit
additives.
more about nutrition.
Absolutely. And of course, here at Kids Cook Real Food, we're on board with, the real
Mhm.
food, getting kids on board in the kitchen
Mhm.
and at the table, getting their buy-in. And so this has been, it's been really helpful. I think it's hopefully, giving parents some new things to Google, some new ideas to think
Yeah.
about. And, it's not always just sort of the standard that all our
Mhm.
kids are individuals. And if we take nothing else away, we got to remember that for real, the sleep, the food, the exercise, the connection with family, with other people, all have such an impact, right? We have one body and one mind, and they are connected. They are
Mhm.
connected. And so
Yes.
that's so important. So thank you again, Dr. Mary Wilde. Folks,
Yes.
go visit her. We'll make sure that you have links to her PDF
Okay.
with nutrition tips,
Mhm.
and links to Compassion Parenting, which
Mhm.
is where you train parents, your membership community,
Okay.
and Resilience School, which is for the teens and tweens who are struggling with that anxiety. And I'm sure families probably go through that together, I would think, because the parents
Yep.
want to learn too. Yeah.
Right. And a lot of times there are siblings that they're like, oh, good, we can all go through it as a whole family. So,
Oh, nice, nice. Well, we've come all the way from snakes on our porch and ducks on our porch to the food we put on our table and the love that we infuse into our families. Thank you again so very much, Dr. Mary Wilde. It's been a pleasure and a treasure. Healthy Parenting Connector listeners, I will see you back next week.